Story 1. America's capture of Guam in the Spanish-American War was pure comedy. The United States ship Charleston, one of the first steel-hulled cruisers ever built by the United States, arrived at Guam and fired a warning shot over the Spanish fort. The Spanish garrison had not yet gotten word that there was a war on. They mistakenly thought the Charleston had fired a salute, a very respectful gesture. The Spanish wanted to return the salute, but the fort's gunpowder was depleted. So the Spanish sent a small delegation to the Charleston, expressing their apologies for being unable to return the salute, for a lack of gunpowder. Captain Henry Glass was grateful for this information and cheerfully informed the Spanish that he would now accept their surrender. The surrender was formalized the following day, with no bloodshed. Story 2. There was a Japanese man called Tsutomu Yamaguchi who was on his way to work in Hiroshima in 1945 when he saw falling through the sky, 2 miles from where he stood, what ultimately turned out to be the atomic bomb. He had just enough time to take cover in a ditch as the bomb detonated, and miraculously he survived. Somehow the Hiroshima train station was still operational, and so Yamaguchi, battered, bombed, and bruised, decided to board a train to his family home so he could recover in Nagasaki. 3 days later, Yamaguchi was called into work to explain what he saw, which he did. At work, as he began to tell the story of what happened, the second bomb dropped. It was the reinforced concrete walls around him that saved him this time, and Yamaguchi quickly ran to find his wife and son. Ground temperatures in the city reached 4,000 degrees Celsius, and radioactive rain poured down. The family's home was destroyed, but Yamaguchi's wife and son had thankfully been out shopping, looking for burn ointment for Yamaguchi, when the bomb fell, and they'd survived. Despite this ordeal of having survived 2 nuclear explosions and subsequent radiation exposure, Yamaguchi went on to live until 93 years of age. He died in 2010 after being recognized by the Japanese government as a Nijiu Hibakusha, or twice-bombed person. Story 3. The Pilgrims landed where and when they did to set up equipment to make beer. Then a Native American comes out of the forest and says in English, "Greetings, Englishmen. Do you have any beer?" They were supposed to settle closer to the Jamestown colony in modern-day Virginia, but they stopped way further north. The immediate area was devoid of tribes or settlements, likely due to a devastating plague. Out pops Samoset, who recently arrived back to his homeland after being enslaved for a number of years by Englishmen. Story 4. In my country, a poodle falling from a balcony killed 3 people. The first death was on impact as it fell on a woman's head. The second person died when they tried to cross the street without looking to help and a bus ran them over. The third died of a heart attack because they witnessed all this. Story 5. Genghis Khan has been attributed to 40 million deaths, so many that farms reverted to forest in such a large amount there was a slight global increase in the oxygen levels. This can be detected in glacial ice of sufficient age and helps in dating. You can find pollen in the ice and then extrapolate the timeline. Story 6. The Chicago World's Fair in 1893. There were so many technological advances presented at the same time, it must have been incredible to have been there. Story 7. That all of the hard drives, compact discs, zip discs, and dozens of boxes of evidence that was photographed at Jeffrey Epstein's house in New York City, every bit of it went missing between the premises being sealed off and a search warrant being issued. Imagine that. Closets with every shelf lined with labeled and cataloged and very well-organized crates and boxes full of data. You come back an hour later and every scrap of it is gone and not one person on scene saw anything, heard anything, or spoke with anybody else. Story 8. The Romanov children were wearing undergarments that had been stitched with so many jewels they survived the initial round of gunfire. The basement room was so full of smoke from all the shots that they had to let the air clear before killing the children with headshots and bayonets. The execution of the Romanov family took over 20 minutes, with most of the children suffering until the very end. Story 9. The Holocaust. The amount of death alone, not including the soldiers and civilians that died during the Second World War, blows my mind, and it's almost unfathomable. Story 10. How the Central Intelligence Agency used vampires to fight communism in the Philippines. In the mid-20th century, the Central Intelligence Agency devised unconventional strategies to combat the spread of communism in the Philippines. One such strategy involved exploiting local superstitions and folklore about vampires. These psychological operations aimed to instill fear among the communist rebels, disrupting their activities and undermining their morale. During this period, the Central Intelligence Agency collaborated with local military units to simulate vampire attacks. They employed various tactics, such as leaving dead bodies with puncture wounds in areas known for superstitious beliefs. This created the illusion that a vampire was on the loose, instilling fear and paranoia among the rebel forces. The strategy was part of a broader effort by the Central Intelligence Agency to utilize psychological warfare in regions where conventional military tactics proved less effective. By exploiting local myths and fears, they aimed to gain a tactical advantage and discourage support for communist movements. While these operations were short-lived and had limited long-term impact, they represent a fascinating chapter in the history of psychological warfare and the lengths to which intelligence agencies have gone to influence adversaries. Story 11. One of the most unbelievable and often overlooked historical events is the Great Penguin Uprising of 1857 in Antarctica. According to obscure reports from early Antarctic explorers, a colony of emperor penguins, believed to have been influenced by exposure to discarded expedition equipment, allegedly organized themselves into a structured society that rivaled human civilization in complexity. Eyewitness accounts, though often dismissed by mainstream historians, describe penguins forming intricate social hierarchies, developing rudimentary tools, and even establishing a system of governance based on pebble-based trade. The supposed rebellion occurred when an overzealous team of whalers attempted to claim a particularly sacred iceberg, leading to what has been described as a highly coordinated penguin offensive. Reports claim that the penguins used diversion tactics, strategically rolling snowballs downhill to confuse the explorers while a select group infiltrated their camp, stealing supplies and sabotaging sleds. The humans, unable to withstand the penguins' relentless flipper-driven assault, were forced to retreat, leaving behind journals that chronicled the event in bewildered detail. Though skeptics argue that extreme cold and isolation may have induced hallucinations in the explorers, proponents of the theory maintain that remnants of an ancient penguin civilization may still be buried beneath the ice, waiting to reclaim their place as the true rulers of the frozen continent. Story 12. The Scottish invaded England when it was vulnerable due to plague, losing and taking the plague back to Scotland. I mean, just leave them to die and then invade. Half the Scottish population died. The plague seems to have started in China in the 1330s. In 1347, armies attacking the town of Kaffa in the Crimea catapulted dead bodies into the town. Italian merchants took the plague with them to Sicily in October 1347. In June 1348, the Black Death arrived at Melcombe Regis in Dorset. By the end of the year, it had spread throughout the south of England. During 1349, the plague spread into Wales, Ireland, and the north of England. The Scots, thinking that God was punishing the English, invaded the north of England, where their army caught the plague. In 1350, therefore, the plague spread through Scotland. The first plague died out in 1350. Story 13. A young Winston Churchill and Indian volunteer Mohandas Gandhi were both present at the Battle of Spion Kop in South Africa in 1900, where the British lost to the Boers. Story 14. The Holocaust. Thinking about the actual lived experiences of so many of the victims and the scale of the cruelty, I just can't help but ask, how could this happen? It's impossible to process. Story 15. Re-electing a guy who tried to overthrow the government based on a complete lie, got convicted of a felony, found liable for sexual assault for President of the United States. Story 16. The Great Molasses Flood. On January 15, 1919, a 50-foot tall molasses tank in Boston's North End burst, releasing 2.3 million gallons of molasses in a 25-foot wave. The wave, traveling at 35 miles per hour, destroyed buildings, damaged cars, and trapped horses. The flood killed 21 people, ranging in age from 10 to 78, and injured around 150 more. Many victims suffocated in the syrup. The rescue effort lasted 4 days, with responders struggling in quicksand-like conditions. Story 17. Chernobyl. Except I didn't read about it, I remember it. April 26, 1986 will be remembered by humans for as long as there are humans, most likely. Story 18. When Japanese farmers were interned during World War II, there were cases of their neighbors buying their lands for very low prices to keep the land in order until the farmers returned. Of course, some people seized the opportunity to gain land for themselves, but there were also good people who recognized that what happened to their neighbors was unjust. Similarly, during the Great Depression, farmers hung nooses from barns at auctions as a threat to bankers and anyone who tried to spend large amounts of money on the foreclosed property. The communities often worked together to buy back the property for the people who lost it. Story 19. Different from many older examples, COVID-19 was not very long ago. It's crazy how advanced we are and how intense some of the restrictions were at that time. Story 20. The Affair of the Poisons. At the court of Louis the Sun King, an argument can be made that the French bid for conquest of Central Europe was brought down by Satanism. Well, indirectly. It goes like this. In the hothouse atmosphere of Versailles, aristocrats fought each other for the attentions of the king, no holds barred. Desperate for money and attention, aristocrats patronized fortune-tellers and charlatans of all sorts. Eventually, these professional fraudsters realized that all their patrons basically wanted two things: to know when rich relations would die, leaving all their money to them, and to gain the affections and attention of the king. Gradually, the fraudsters went from telling fortunes to providing magic designed to bring about these desired outcomes, selling inheritance powders, that is, poisons, to deal with unwanted relations, and selling charms to attract the king's attentions. To make these more impressive, they increasingly surrounded these sales with an atmosphere of black magic, eventually holding satanic rituals complete with the blood of infants and other impressive props. High aristocrats were involved. Some current and former mistresses of the king allegedly performed in these satanic rituals, acting literally as naked altars bent over to receive a blasphemous baptism designed to entice the king's wandering eye through the devil's help. Sort of like a heavy metal album cover come to life. None of the evidence for any of this meets modern scrutiny, of course, but whether it was true in detail or not, it was certainly believed to be true at the time. The notion that fraudsters would use Satanism to extract cash out of gullible aristocrats isn't inherently unbelievable. Eventually, the scandal broke and some 30 people were executed, mostly the fraudsters and underlings. The high aristocrats were just forced into exile and disgraced. One of these was the Countess of Soissons, who left her son behind at the French court. Her son was bullied and humiliated, in part due to his unfortunate appearance, but largely due to his mother's disgrace. He wanted to be a soldier when he grew up. This ambition was personally ridiculed by King Louis, who made a point of publicly stating that the scrawny and ugly sons of disgraced satanic mothers do not become soldiers of France. Rather, he should become a priest. The kid left France with a massive chip on his shoulder. He went to Austria, became a soldier, and was instrumental in defeating the armies of Louis at the decisive Battle of Blenheim. The son, of course, was Prince Eugene of Savoy. Without the satanic scandal, he would probably never have left France, and history would be very different. Story 21. The Bone Wars. The rivalry between two paleontologists that disrupted their profession for a long time. I don't understand why a movie hasn't been made about this yet. Story 22. America's participation in slavery, especially the behavior of the religious or of our founding fathers, is horrifying to think about, only to be surpassed by the deception of the indigenous people. Story 23. Tulsa Race Massacre. Segregationists were dropping bombs from planes, called it a riot by African Americans, and then the terrorists covered it up and have been misleading America about it ever since. Story 24. The Tulsa, Oklahoma Race Massacre of 1921. I have a degree in history, and I was ashamed to have never even heard of this until seeing it portrayed in the Watchmen television series. Story 25. The story of the Titanic is still unbelievable to me. Not just the sinking, but how confident people were that the ship was unsinkable. The sheer scale of the disaster, with so many lifeboats not even being filled to capacity, and the class divisions that played out during the evacuation, it's like something out of a tragic novel. The fact that it happened over 100 years ago, but it still feels so relevant and surreal, shows how some events just stay with you. It's hard to wrap your head around how such an advanced piece of technology at the time could have met such a brutal fate. Story 26. Imagining a European colonizer setting foot on African or South American soil for the first time and seeing the vastly different wildlife. Just imagine what that must have felt like. Story 27. Regardless of what you think about the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project in the United States during World War II is an incredible feat of engineering, physics, mathematics, and security. Story 28. The Revolutionary War. Despite the general idea of farmers turned military men gathering together to beat one of the greatest forces in human history, when you read the details, it seems like we are living in some bizarre world where the United States actually won. So many battles were lucky. The soldiers endured such hardship during the winter and hot summers. No pay, no real barracks or consistent food, all to risk their lives against a seemingly unstoppable opponent. The colonial army got so lucky so many times against all odds to pull off one of the greatest victories in human history.